So many times throughout life, we find ourselves in situations that seem very overwhelming, or they seem to where sometimes it seems like there's no way out, or we feel that we are being treated unfairly. And looking back, one of the first times that I was kind of aware of this type of thing was in middle school. And I think at that age, aside from the obvious physical changes that our bodies go through, our minds are kind of coming to an age where we're a little bit more self-aware, and so we don't have the same kind of day-to-day routine, if we had a routine, when we were younger up until that point. And so, you know, a lot of it's socialization, new friendships, new relationships, kind of discovering the way primal interaction works, but also the social levels on top of that. And that was one of the times when I first became conscious of my potential to be self-destructive. And obviously it was in different ways when I was 12, 13, 14 than later on in life. But nonetheless, I found that it was just something that kind of formed out of a need to make sense of everything. And where I'm going with this is as we get older, we start to kind of explore more relationships, but yet we find that sometimes we react to them, or we act in them in similar fashion, from one relationship to the next. And oftentimes when we find ourselves in these scenarios where we feel we're being treated unfairly, we ask ourselves, well, you know, well, why me? Or why am I going through this? Or why is everything so difficult? Or, man, sometimes it's just one thing after another, and life just doesn't let up, right? And so a lot of times what we do ultimately is we adopt this kind of victim mentality. And I'm not talking about, I think we should differentiate that between, you know, you're walking down the street and somebody comes up and robs you, right? I mean, that's physical harm, physical threat, the threat of physical violence. It's different from when we feel threatened in a social context or in the context of day-to-day life, whether it's at work, stress from work, stress from family life, home life, or any other relationship for that matter. And I guess our tendency is to, at least let me speak for myself, my tendency sometimes is to want to blame that particular person or that particular circumstance or environment or whatever the case may be. And what I have found over time is that it is really more a question of where I am personally at that point in time, what my frame of mind is like, what my attitude is like, whether or not I've got my strengths and weaknesses kind of in check and I'm conscious and aware of them in such a way to where I can ideally better myself. And so one of the things that has helped me, and I'm going to share with you here in just a second how it helped me and kind of the process that I took. When I was 23, I came upon, let's call it various principles in search for, I guess, what we might call recovery. And I say that in a general sense because in a previous video I talked about how we are all kind of self-destructive in one way or another. And so I don't want to limit that self-destructive aspect that the majority of us have to just the things that I've experienced, but you have your own experiences as well. And so what I found that was helpful for me was what's kind of generally loosely referred to as a moral inventory. And it was taught to me by various people through a book that I also kind of use as a resource from time to time. And essentially what it involves is kind of figuratively looking at myself in the mirror. And the goal of this exercise is to ultimately identify strengths and weaknesses, but ways that I can look at them as objectively as possible. Which obviously we're all biased based off our experiences, because we view the world essentially through the lens of our experiences up to that point where we are in life. But so what it involves is you take a sheet of paper, okay, and I guess I should preface with saying that you should probably only do this if you're ready for something like this, and maybe we're not ever ready, but what I mean is that it can be a painful process anytime that we grow in terms of our character. For me, at least, it's usually it involves some sort of pain. The goal of this is to kind of look at ourselves. If you look at yourself like an onion, right? So you've got the onion itself. And as you peel back the different, I don't even know what they're called, those call them layers, you find that there's additional layers with each layer that you peel off. And so that is kind of what I found is what happens to me when I go through this specific moral inventory process. And so what you do is you get a sheet of paper or a journal or whatever it is that you're going to use to write, you type it up on your computer, and you make 3 columns. You can make 4 if you want, but so you get your sheet of paper and you make your 3 columns. And on the first column, the far left column, just write who or write person. And when I did it for the first time, I just listed out everybody that I was pissed off at, right, for one reason or another, and going back as far back as I could remember in my life, from the most, what I consider to be trivial experience up until the most recent experience, however trivial or however significant it seemed in my mind. And so I listed all these people out, and it was a long list, right? I mean, at the time, I guess I was, like I said, 23 years old, but I made this list of people that I had resentments towards. And in the next column, what you do is you talk about the event or the scenario or the circumstances, right? So now you've got, you may or may not be able to see it from there, but now you've got 2 columns, right? So you've got the person, you list the person's name, or it could even be like a company or an institution, and in the next column you talk about the scenario, basically the thing that pissed you off, and describe it. You know, just say, this person pissed me off because they did X, Y, Z. However you want to write it. In the next column, this is where you can do 3 or 4 columns. So in the next column, you can take it a step further, and you can write what it was about you that felt threatened. And it's usually some form of fear, right? So, you know, maybe somebody ripped you off, or maybe somebody said something insulting and it threatened your character, or it threatened your pride, or it threatened your ego. However you want to define that, right? So you can make in that 3rd column, call it fear, or how was I threatened, right? Okay, so now you've got the person that pissed you off, you've got the event, the circumstances, and in the next column, how you felt threatened by it. In the final column, and this is the one where I said there's a potential for pain, right? Because the 4th column, you talk about yourself. So you say, you ask yourself, really you can just kind of title it my role, right? My role in that situation. You can skip the 3rd column if you want with the fear and just kind of summarizing the 4th one, however you want to do it. But basically the point of the final column is to the figurative looking at oneself in the mirror, right? So let's say that you were somewhere and, I don't know, somebody said something that you took in an insulting way. And so that threatened your pride because you were in mixed company, everybody was laughing, and you felt like an idiot, right? So what was your role in that scenario, right? And usually for me, I'm either embarrassed or I'm angry, or maybe I said something that led up to that person responding to me, or maybe I was an asshole, you know, the week before, or something, right? Or whatever the case may be. And so write down your personal role in that scenario. And what this ultimately does is you complete your list, right? You go back as far as you can remember and up to the, you know, the most recent experience that you had. And the final thing that you do is you study that last column, and maybe even the last two columns, right? So that the way that you felt threatened, your fears, and then your personal role in those situations. And what ultimately happens, and it's kind of a natural thing, and it's not, this isn't a spoiler or anything like that, but you look at those two columns and you start to recognize patterns in the way that you conduct yourself from one relationship to the next, or from one scenario to the next, set of circumstances to the next. And what ultimately happens is you discover that you are the common denominator, right? Not all these people outside of you. And I'll be honest, when I first did this process, for me, it was use the word humbling, but I mean, if you talk about being humbled, and you know, is it really true humility? I don't know, but it was very. It opened my mind to the possibility that life in general really has nothing to do with these things that are external of my experience, and it really is all my reaction, the way I conduct myself, my attitude, my approach to things, and how I deal with what I perceive to be stress, right? And for me, it basically ruined my life, because I discovered that as much as I want to blame people around me for whatever it is, it's just, I'm human. It obviously still happens, but I understand that when I do that it's bullshit, right? It's just me telling myself that it's someone else's fault. And so that's why I kind of gave a qualifier at the beginning saying, look, if you're not ready to do this, by all means don't do it, because it probably will ruin your life, to the point to where you will have to take responsibility for your circumstances, for where you are in life, in all areas. You know, whether it's financially, whether it's spiritually, whether it's where you are in terms of fitness, where you are in terms of diet, where you are in terms of the way you react to what you perceive to be stress. All areas, right? But it's also very helpful, and it's also very freeing, because we often find ourselves enslaved to the things that consume our minds, our obsessions, the things that we like, the things that we value even, and ultimately it becomes a question of, at least I start to ask myself, you know, what is the actual nature of reality, and how can I kind of best maneuver myself through this maze, through this madness, right? With me, I tend to do it with art, with music, because the music is my constant, right? So I encourage you to do this if you find yourself in a place of feeling overwhelmed. Especially this time of year, it can be very stressful for a lot of people, but it could lend, or it could give way to you viewing life, or you viewing yourself in a different way, if you don't already do this, right? For me, it's helpful to write things down, because it's the transfer of the let's call it the madness in my head onto something tangible that I can kind of review. And it really, it gives a central location for all of my thoughts and all of my inclinations to blame others, and kind of view them in a way that is, because I tend to be analytical, I can analyze them and look at them in at least as much of an unbiased way as possible. So I want to close with, recently I wrote an article that I shared with you on Facebook about a good friend of mine named James Floyd, and he wrote a poem that, in my opinion, kind of touches on these types of issues. And you can find his book, Some Gentle Moving Thing, online. You can find it on Amazon. But it's basically a collection of different things that he's written that I consider to be part of this process, whether it's his own personal moral inventory or whether it's just kind of the transmission of these thoughts into something tangible. And really what it is the sharing of experience. So this poem here, it's called The Outsider, and aptly named to kind of the things that we're talking about when we feel like we are the outsider. And it goes like this. I used to ask myself, what did I do to deserve this? And now I find myself asking, what did I do not to deserve this? Whatever gave me the idea that I, and I alone, should be above suffering? For if I were above suffering in this world, I would surely be alone. Then my loneliness would be my suffering. Dreams are for those of time and leisure. I am of neither, yet I still dream. And because I dream, each dream I dream becomes a pin that pricks me, yet draws no blood. And I cannot even say, look, come see the scars inflicted by my dreams. Thanks for letting me share.